Thank you, Jeff, for that very kind introduction. And I have no difficulty liking you either. And I have no sentence after that. I'm going to leave it right there. But it's really true. And I am grateful to be here today and for the next couple of days with all of you, though I am puzzled at the bureaucratic snafu by which only Keith and I got the memo about attire. And I don't know how that happened. But there's time. There are stores around if you want to buy a tie. And I'll sell you mine. A cuckolded God. There, I've said it, and I'll leave it right there. That's the image that I think most comes to mind for most people in relationship to the book of Hosea. A cuckolded God and a cuckolded prophet. We don't say the word very often because it's too embarrassing and frightening. And yet I think the book itself has become appealing precisely because of its opening image that grabs us in ways that are both frightening and exciting. It appeals at one level to our deepest fears and, if I can be so blunt, our deepest fantasies. And yet, and here's one of the arguments I want to make today and tomorrow and the next day, is that if that's the only image we come away from Hosea, then we haven't quite understood the book. The message of the book cannot easily be paraphrased in the words of that great philosopher and singer Hank Williams. Your cheating heart will tell on you. You'll cry and cry before it's through. No sleep will come the whole night through. Your cheating heart will tell on you. That's only part of Hosea. It is great music, to be sure. And I think Aristotle and Hank Williams are probably talking to each other somewhere in the afterlife. That's what I think. But, so I like both of them, actually. You don't get Aristotle jokes very often, by the way, do you? So I want to start by thinking about that. So if it's not just a book about adultery and a cheating heart, what is it? How do you understand the book? It's true that is one of the images, and a major one, and a very arresting one. Though it is also, I think, a warning to all of us preachers. Be careful what metaphor you start with, because it's not always easy to recover from it. I'm sure that's purely hypothetical in all our experiences, but in my experience, be careful where you start. How do you understand the book? I want to start by saying I think there are two frameworks that interlock in this book. One of them is what I want to call wisdom, and the other is narrative, a history. And I'll just take you to the very last line of the book, the very last verse. The book ends this way. Who is wise and understands these things, discerning and knows them? The ways of Yahweh are righteous, and the righteous walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them. It's always interesting to read the end of things, and I myself usually start with the end of a book. I read the end, then I read the footnotes. This is hard when it's a set of love letters to people or things like that. But that's how I start oftentimes, and I think it helps in starting with Hosea. How does whoever put this book together think that you're supposed to encounter it? And one of the ways seems, I think, to be revealed by this last line. And then you ask yourself, why does it take wisdom to understand the book? And what does it have to do with righteous living versus wicked living? And then you realize, well, this book sounds, the whole language of wisdom and understanding and knowing sounds very much like the language of sages, of wise people in ancient Israel who are trying to sort out the difference between wisdom and folly, knowledge and ignorance, and virtue and vice. And so one way to understand this book is to think of it as being in some ways the prophetic equivalent of a book like Ecclesiastes or Proverbs. You remember how the book of Ecclesiastes ends. It has this voice, not exactly, almost to the end. It has this voice that says, Kohelet, the author of the book, was wise and discerning. And he arranged riddles and proverbs. And he taught the people knowledge. And that's a comment on the fact that if you read Ecclesiastes, you find that sometimes it seems to be going one direction, and sometimes it seems to be going a different direction. And then you go to the next verse, and it's doing that all over again. And it seems to be saying to the reader, look, this is complicated, and the world is complicated, and it's going to take some wisdom to discern how to understand it. That, I think, is also true in Hosea, because the book often talks about doom and despair. I almost want an agony on me. I need another country music reference. And then it will turn around and say, and there's also the possibility of restoration, of hope and renewal. It is a love song and two love songs woven together. And so to make sense of it requires wisdom, not just as a matter of understanding, but as a matter of moral formation. And that's why the text says, the righteous follow the ways of Yahweh, which are righteous, just, which also means the book in some ways is a defense of the actions of God. And it is a call to those who wish to be righteous to live into the actions of God. Now, the other framework that I think is important is the framework of story. New Testament scholars, I hate to give credit to New Testament scholars. I mean, after all, you're mostly talking about how the authors of the New Testament quoted the Old Testament over and over. But New Testament scholars often talk about the narrative, or sometimes Richard Hayes is the parade example, the narrative substructure of the text. That behind the surface of the text there is a story, a plot with characters who do important things. And that plot may not be stated explicitly, but it's assumed. The reader knows that that plot is there. So it seems to me that if you read Hosea, if you read Hosea in the slides in the order I thought they were in, you do have a narrative substructure. There are some themes that show up again and again that the book assumes that the readers know. For example, we hear about the Exodus. When Israel was a child, I loved him and I called my son out of Egypt. And that, as it is in Amos, as it is in Isaiah, especially the middle of Isaiah, as it is in other texts, this is simply assumed as part of the thought world of ancient readers. And to be Israelite meant to know and to try to live into the story of the Exodus. It is the center of the faith. But the other part of this story is that Israel throughout its history has engaged in idolatry, the worship of the Baals. If you read only Hosea, I don't think you would assume that the worship of Baal and Asherah and the rest of the heavenly entourage was an innovation or something that happened recently. I think you would assume that that's the way it had always been. Now, that's not exactly the same picture you see in Judges, but it's close. It's close enough. And for Hosea's purposes, it's close enough. That in contrast, so the story is that the actor God, on the one hand, is a God of grace and mercy who delivers the people of Israel with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, not because they deserve it, but because of His grace. And on the other hand, Israel, well, Israel is an upsetting group of people, annoying to be around, because they are Well, they have serious character flaws. They don't understand. They don't listen. They don't remember. And they're ungrateful. Other than that, they're great people. So that's part of the story too. And the third part of the story, I think, is the announcement of doom, which is, well, almost pick a page. It's all over the place, and we'll look at some of the text about that. And the fourth part of the story, well, this is important actually, because the announcement of doom comes from the prophets. You remember that Amos will say, the Lord Yahweh does nothing without revealing His will to His servants, the prophets. Or you have this wonderful story in the book of Genesis, in which three people show up at Abraham and Sarah's house for supper, and they have lamb and curds, which is not actually kosher, at least in later law, but who cares? They have this meal, and they eat it, and at the end of it, God, who showed up for dinner somehow, says to Abraham, says to himself, look, I need to tell Abraham what I'm about to do. And he says, well, you remember the story. We've been getting these prayers in heaven. They're very bad about these people in Sodom and Gomorrah. We're going to find out if they're true or not, and if they are, we will know what to do about it. But you can't, even if you're God, justifiably simply wipe out people. You have to warn them and give them a chance to repentance, because that process is an act of justice. Which is why Abraham says, shall the judge of all the earth do what is wrong? Because to wipe them out without knowing for sure what the situation was, going through processes of discernment, would be wrong. So that's the third thing in the book. The fourth thing is, the fourth part of the story is the defeat of the nations. The defeat of the nation of Israel by the Assyrian Empire. About the year 745, before the Common Era, the Assyrian Empire was restored to its power that it had enjoyed in the previous century. Because in that year, a man came to the throne named Tiglath-Pileser III, who I think of as the Napoleon of the 8th century BC. I didn't say it wasn't a geeky reference. I just said that's the reference. A brilliant general, politician, who restored the empire to the center of Near Eastern politics. And he and his successors invaded Israel and Judah on several occasions. According to the book of 2 Kings, on the first invasion by Tiglath-Pileser, he installed a ruler named Hosea, the son of Elah, as king. And for a number of years, Hosea ben Elah paid his tribute to the Assyrian overlord, but he decided somewhere at 724, let's say, that he had had enough and that he was not going to do it anymore. And the Assyrians invaded the land swiftly and fiercely and laid siege to Samaria, which fell in the summer of 722. That event shapes the book of Hosea profoundly. And the book wouldn't make sense, I think, without knowing that event happened. That the destruction of a culture happened. The fifth thing is, though, in the narrative, the expectation that the people of Israel will return to Yahweh. This is built all over the book. Actually, the way the book is structured reflects this idea. The book has, I think, 3 parts. Chapters 1 to 3, chapters 4 to 11, and chapters 12 to 14. And each part starts with an oracle of doom, and then finally winds its way around to some sort of oracle of hope. Because it's not just enough to tell people that bad things are going to happen to them. That's not prophetic preaching, right? If all you want to do is scold, that's not prophetic preaching. It is fun, yes, but it's not prophetic preaching. Because, well, I've said this before, if we take on the career of pointing out human folly, well, we've picked a really easy job, right? There's plenty of material to work with. You'll find people agree with you as long as you don't point the finger at them, and it makes you feel very righteous as long as you don't look in the mirror. So it's an easy job. It's not prophetic preaching, however. The prophets, all of them, move in one way or another to an expectation of hope. And that's part of the imagination that they call their readers to. Now, the last thing, though, that I think is part of the story, and there are other pieces, but I'll stop here for this section. The last thing to note about this story is that hope is not easily won. And that's, I think, why the book starts with the metaphor of cuckoldry, of the cheating heart. Because even if you can somehow put back together a marriage like that, or put back together the parent-child relationship described in chapter 11, it's going to be hard. And grace is not cheap. It is costly. And Hosea wishes his audience to hear that. Now, there are a lot of other things to say, and I will plan to say some of them, but I'm struck by a few things. Why do you start with the language of relationships? What's the rhetorical effect of this? When Deuteronomy in chapter 1 describes the murmuring in the wilderness, particularly with relationship to the 12 spies, one of the arguments it makes is an argument from the nature of reality. And it says the nature of reality is that Yahweh carried you like a father does a child through the wilderness. It is emotional appeal of a very deep sort that says we're not talking here just about a transactional relationship, a set of do's and don'ts, a set of business obligations, a set of contractual things that we've entered into. We're talking about a deep relationship that involves human emotions and commitments and fears and hopes. It is deeply buried in the human heart, and to understand either its success or its failure requires some attention to the emotional life of human beings, not just as individuals, but as groups of people. That's why Hosea 1-3 is so heartbreaking. And so is the rest of the book. And so, in some ways, is the story of faith as a whole. And that, I think, is maybe worth hearing. So let me work through these slides that are not in quite the order I wanted to talk about. There are some characters in this story. One of those characters is the prophet. The role of the prophet is, as Hosea chapter 6 says, to slay and to lacerate the people of Israel. To say to them, I have hewn you, I have slain you with the words of the prophets. Now, if I have to be hewn and slain, the words of the prophets would be one of my chosen weapons, I have to say, right? It's better than the literally being hewn and slain. But part of the job of the prophet is to call things what they truly are, to speak truth. Now, of course, it's not a fun job. Anybody who signed, this is why at my school we don't have a major called prophecy, right? Recruiting would be brutal for such a job, because anybody who would sign up for it would be somebody you wouldn't want to have the job, right? That's an obvious sign of lunacy. But nobody would want the job because of that. But there's another side to it too. Chapter 9, verse 8 talks about the prophet as the sentinel, the watch person. I say watch person because, of course, some prophets are women, right? For Israel. The person who must look out for Israel and must deliver Israel. Chapter 12 gives the parade example of a prophet, Moses. Well, why don't we turn there for just a minute, if you would. Hosea 12. And he says it this way, starting verse 10. I spoke to the prophets. It was I who multiplied visions, right? Because a just God warns people before bad things happen. And through the prophets I will bring destruction. In Gilead there is iniquity. They shall surely come to nothing, which says this must be an oracle at the very beginning of Hosea's work, because Gilead was annexed by Syria 734. In Gilead there is iniquity, they will come to nothing. In Gilgal they sacrifice bulls, so their altars shall be like stone heaps on the furrows of the field. Jacob fled to the land. And now he takes you to a part of the story which sometimes shows up in Hosea, though it's debatable how crucial it is to his understanding, but the story of the patriarchs. Jacob fled to the land of Aram. There Israel served for a wife, actually 2 wives and 2 part wives, but who's counting? And for a wife he guarded sheep. By a prophet the Lord brought Israel up from Egypt, and by a prophet he was guarded. There's a view of prophecy in the book of Hosea that's probably worth hearing, because it is yes, the vision of the messenger who speaks on behalf of God. But the point is, it's a messenger who speaks on behalf of God, which means that the words spoken by the prophet, if they can be authenticated, and that's of course a problem. Deuteronomy and Jeremiah both talk about that as a problem. How do you know the prophet spoke for God? But if the prophet in fact spoke for God, then the claim that the word has on the life of people is immensely pressing. You don't say, yeah, the prophet was right and he didn't. That is what God said, but I don't know if I really want to take that seriously. That's like saying, yes, there's a truck 3 feet from me at moving 60 miles an hour, but I'd like to think it over, right? That doesn't make sense. It's not rational. So the word has this claim on the hearer that is powerful. Whoever is wise and has understanding should understand what that means. But of course the thing is, and I think the book is already aware of this, how does that word hit a given audience? I mean, after all, what we have in the book of Hosea are the words of the prophet Hosea over some period of time, but we don't know that they're a transcript of his words, word for word. We don't know the order in which he gave them. We don't know the tone in which he gave some of them. But we do know that at some point somebody wrote them down and organized them and expected other people to read them, and that those people who read them or heard them read, probably that's a better way to say it, were not for very long the very same people who heard him for the first time, right? So the people who hear him in the next generation and the next and the next down to us hear it how? I'm not very worried about the Assyrians. I find them interesting, actually, mainly because I've never had to meet any. Actually, I find most people interesting that I've never had to meet. But not that I dislike people, it's just that I dislike many people, that's all. But that's not true. I love everybody equally. But surely the voice is still alive, because the prophet's words still speak, even if they don't speak in exactly the same way they originally did. Well, we know that, of course. There are other characters here. One is the king. Yes, that book would be a great graduation gift, by the way, and it is available on Amazon in a nice pink cover if you want to buy it. But the book talks about kings in different ways. It never says anything nice about them. Now, for us, that may not be a big deal because we decided a long time ago that George III was going to be for us George the Last, and we were ready to be rid of kings. And so we don't maybe have the same association that ancient people did, but for ancient people, the king was just about that far removed from God. The king was a person who was untouchable, holy. In some cultures, the king was thought to be able to heal or to bring the rain, which none of us assume our leaders can do, I think. So to say that the kings are all bad is an important statement, that the leadership structure in Israel had failed to such an extent that it could not be redeemed. The one exception to this, I think, is chapter 3, which we'll get to in more detail in a little while, in which he says it this way. Verse 4, chapter 3, verse 4, "For the Israelites will remain many days without king or prince, sacrifice, pillar, ephod, or teraphim. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king." Which is interesting because I'm guessing that if Hosea said to most people in North Israel, yeah, someday we're going to follow David, our king, that's not all that exciting to people. That's like Texans rooting for the Yankees, right? I mean, the New York Yankees. That's not... It's actually any human beings rooting for the New York Yankees, but it's not acceptable. And so to say that the king is compromised is important. It's actually a move that other prophets are making at the same time. The book of Isaiah, for example, has this discussion in chapter 32 about the righteous king who will come, a human being who will get it all right. And then chapter 33 sort of ditches that idea and says, oh, by the way, we're going to wait for God to be king. Because if we wait for a king who reigns in righteousness, it could take a while. So that's one of the characters, is the king. Another character is Assyria. I don't know. It's hard to exaggerate the importance of the encounter with this empire for the history of Israel and therefore the Bible. How many parts of the Bible reflect a knowledge of the Assyrian Empire? The books of Kings, Chronicles, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Ezekiel knew about them. Hosea, Amos, Nahum, and there are some others. It'd be hard to exaggerate the importance of this because when the Bible thinks about leadership and politics, which it does a lot, one of the ways of leading, one of the ways of doing politics that's in its head, if I could say it that way, is the way it was done in Assyria, which was an empire based, at least in large measure, in ways that its successor empires actually modified because it didn't work very well, but an empire based on terror. A king and a piety. Now, that may seem like an odd mix, but actually in human history it's been fairly common that powerful nations appeal to God or the gods to validate what they do, even though what they do is an exercise in naked power. So you see, this is from the British Museum, an Assyrian king praying to his gods. Those are the little things in the corner. I don't know if you can see that well. Or a king here praying, he is doing some kind of ritual around a tree of life. I don't know if you can buy these at Lowe's. I don't think so. But the idea is, I think the idea is, though it's not really clear, it's like Masonic rituals. Who knows what actually happens? But it's a ritual that apparently brings life to the world. The king brings life to the world. And so one side of the tree of life is the king, and on the other side is the king of the gods. They're praying together and talking together to bring life to the world. Or they kill lions. Just take your concordance sometime and look up the word lion in the minor prophets. Amos, Hosea, Joel, they're fascinated by lions, partly because the Assyrians were fascinated by lions. Well, who wouldn't be, actually? And war, and even lion hunting. I don't know if you can see that picture that well, but I'm assuming that this is not a literal depiction of an event, right? But it is actually a picture of the way the kings of Assyria understood themselves as the great hunter who brought order to the world. And it's so important is this image that it is on the great seal of the Assyrian Empire. It is the way they understood themselves. So if you live in that world and you're Hosea, then you have to make sense of that. You have to respond to that, because the Bible doesn't just talk to itself. It has this complicated network of conversations with itself, yes, and with things going on in the larger world. And we have to understand both to make sense of it. Well, we know that too. So let me talk about, this is the next section, settings and context. The book of Hosea is part of a larger collection of books that we sometimes call the book of the 12 minor prophets. This book was put together, well, it's hard to say exactly when. It must have been sometime after the last part of it, Malachi and Zechariah, so sometime in the late Persian period or maybe the Greek period, though the various books in it are older than that. And it was put together in different orders. It depends on which ancient manuscript you read. But it seems somehow or another, and this is a discussion among scholars that actually we should really comment on by saying we just don't know about a lot of this. But there was a sense in ancient times that somehow these books belong together. So you have big scrolls of the prophets. You have Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the book of the 12 minor prophets, and they are connected to each other in some ways, right? So Joel ends by talking about the lion roaring, and Amos opens by talking about the lion roaring, and so on. So, and there are other kinds of connections that fit them together. They're supposed to be read in some ways as interrelated. And I think that's actually helpful for preaching, because the message they give does fit together, but it's not always the same thing over and over, which is helpful in preaching, by the way. At least I've found it so. So that whereas Amos gives you this extraordinary message about the justice of God, God is a righteous God who vindicates the righteous and punishes the wicked and brings truth and justice to the world. That image is complemented by Hosea's image that is not so much about human justice, though he believes in that and he does talk about it, but it's about the majesty of God. That this is a book not just about the cuckolded God. Actually, you have to be a very great God to allow your prophet to use an image like that. That's not for the faint of heart, even for the Almighty, I think. I mean that in all seriousness. But a book about the majesty of God and the gracious activity of God. Now, Amos believes that too and talks about it too a lot, but the balance is different. So these books fit together somehow. I went through, I don't know about you, but when I watched the movie A Beautiful Mind, I thought, I don't see what the problem is with this guy. Why did they see it this way? I thought that in Wrath of Khan too, by the way, just so you know. But it's interesting to me how these books end. they all begin in basically the same way. The words of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, during the reign of so-and-so and so-and-so. Almost all of them begin that way, right? Which is to say that whoever put the books together was doing them in the same way. That this is how you start a prophetic book, right? That's how they thought about it. But it's also interesting that they all end in a similar way, because that's how you end a prophetic book. You end a prophetic book, well, you just go through the list. And by the way, I'll give Stan these slides if you want them, and so, or even if you don't want them, I'll give them to him. But they open up with things, well, Hosea ends with an oracle of salvation. Joel ends with an oracle of salvation that has something to do with grasshoppers. And if I don't know. Theological entomology, that's what it's about. Amos ends with an oracle of salvation. Obadiah, well, it is an oracle of salvation for Israel, not so much for Edom. Jonah ends by saying, having God say, shh, look at all those innocent people. Shouldn't I have concern about them? Which is a question. Shouldn't I give an oracle of salvation? Jonah, what's with you, bud? Micah ends with, who is a God like you? And then an oracle of salvation. Nahum ends with an oracle of doom, yes, because it's a very happy, joyful book. But it ends with an oracle of doom for Assyria, which is kind of by definition an oracle of hope for Judah. Habakkuk ends the same way. Zephaniah ends the same way. Haggai ends the same way. Zechariah and Malachi sort of in the same way. So I think that's how you end a prophetic book, at least in the books of the 12 minor prophets. It's how Ezekiel ends too, by the way. Isaiah sort of ends that way with all the bad people dead, which is good if you're not one of the bad people. So there's a pattern. I'll talk about structure later. The book opens, and I just have a couple of minutes, but I will do this. The book opens with a date, sort of, which interestingly is dated to the reigns of the kings of Judah. And I say that's interesting because Hosea worked in Israel, not in Judah. But I'm guessing, and I think it's probably right, that whoever put the book together was living in Judah. Maybe because there wasn't an Israel to live in anymore. But he does also say, and in the days of King Jeroboam, the son of Joash. And then the opening of the book, when Yahweh first spoke through Hosea, Yahweh said to Hosea, "Go, take for yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom." This is, I am sure, and I mean this in all seriousness too, the worst possible call to ministry a person has ever had. Right? I would think so. But it is a call not just to say words, but to live a particular sort of life that reflects those words. And in that sense, it is a model for the ministry of the rest of us. He is called to live into the life that God is experiencing with Israel. Now, I don't know what it means when it says a wife of whoredom. I don't know what her sexual history was up till this point. I'm not sure I can figure out what it was after that point. And honestly, I was taught that you didn't ask questions like that. And so for me, I don't get, as far as you know, excited about questions like that. Think about that a little bit. Don't think about that a little bit. Because it seems to me that ultimately this is not a book about Hosea and his marriage. And so preaching that tries to psychologize this text and say, boy, wouldn't it be bad to go through this, is, if I can say this directly, missing the point. Though of course, there is an emotional identification with it. It's missing the point, though, because what this is really about is the search for metaphors, this is only the first, not the last, the search for metaphors adequate to describe God's consternation with human beings and the utter failure of His creation to do what He has asked it to do, even though what He's asked it to do is to live a life that reflects graciousness and mercy. And they find it hard. Now, this, of course, is all over the Old Testament, right? Deuteronomy will say that this Torah is not hard for you. It is not in heaven, so that one should have to scale to heavens, like Nimrod or somebody, or across the sea, but it is near you. It is in your heart. That's Deuteronomy's version of the same idea. And so this book wants to say that, it portrays God as having deep dismay over the failure of Israel to live into what should have been easy and life-giving. And this is the first image of it. And I think this is a really important point. I'm going to talk tomorrow about how assuming I find my tie for tomorrow, I want to talk tomorrow about some do's and don'ts about using this imagery, because it's very dangerous, especially for male preachers in a congregation that doesn't include just men, which is pretty much all of them. It is a dangerous set of images because so there are men who see themselves as God, right? And their wives as the servant. And there are women who've experienced great hardship because of ways of using images like this. Not the image itself, I'm going to argue, but images like this. So if I can pull this together, I hope we begin to hear these words as an invitation to wisdom and an invitation to live into the story of a God and a people whose relationship was terribly estranged for a long time, but was knitted together and restored. It is ultimately not the story of a failure, but the story of a success. Because at the end of it, Israel is renewed. And the God who delivered people from bondage in Egypt delivered them from bondage again and again, just as that God has done for us. Oh, glory be to you, Lord God, King of the universe, in Jesus Christ our Lord. May we hear these words not as strange words from long ago, but as living words that quicken our hearts and minds and hands and feet to be your people wherever we go. Hear our prayer, O Lord, through Jesus Christ. Amen.